Her simple Burger King employee is ridiculed by her colleagues until a millionaire shows up and says she'll be the new supervisor. The smell of fried food permeated the cheap uniform as laughter rent the air. The girl, with the crooked Burger King badge, let her tray tremble in her hands, while her colleagues jeered loudly, making sure everyone in the room heard. "Look at the fast food princess!" one of them shouted, eliciting laughter from the customers. The young woman, red with embarrassment, choked back tears, feeling the humiliation grow as the tray slipped, and a soda burst onto the floor, splashing her worn sneakers. The manager, with a sneer, simply commented, "Aren't you even good enough to hold a glass?" People whispered, some filming with their cell phones, others looking away. The silence inside her was deafening, her heart heavy, her body immobile, and the certainty that once again she was being reduced to nothing before the world. But in that moment, when there seemed no escape, a watchful eye watched her from the back table. As the awkward silence fell, a firm voice interrupted the collective laughter. A tall, impeccably dressed man rose from his table and walked toward the scene. His colleagues gulped, some trying to hide their cell phones, others laughing nervously. He looked at the manager with icy calm and said, "Interesting to see how you treat someone who supports their own business." The confused manager stammered, but the curious audience sensed something was wrong. The man then pulled a silver key engraved with the franchise logo from his pocket. "Funny, because this unit belongs to me." The shock was immediate. The entire room fell into absolute silence, and the girl's heart raced. He turned to her and said, without raising his voice, "Starting today, you're the new supervisor, and everyone who laughed will now learn the meaning of respect." The cameras that had previously recorded his embarrassment now recorded the beginning of an unforgettable turnaround. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. In the diner lit by neon lights flashing in the American night, Burger King bustled with the sound of fryers, hurried orders, and conversations between customers coming from different parts of the city. It was one of those places where time seemed to pass faster, where exhausted workers stopped by for a quick bite to eat before returning to their night shift, and boisterous young people crowded the tables in the back recording videos for social media. The atmosphere seemed normal, but for those working behind the counter, every detail carried the weight of a silent war. There, amidst the mingled voices and the smell of oil, stood the girl, discreet, in a uniform marked by hours of effort and dark circles that betrayed restless nights. Her movements were precise, almost automatic, trying to avoid any slip-up that might become the target of the colleagues who surrounded her like vultures waiting for a mistake. The manager, a middle-aged man with an arrogant posture, walked around the room as if he owned the world, ignoring customers while giving her hard looks, always ready to criticize. Her colleagues, dressed in the same uniform, never missed a chance to make snide comments about her shy demeanor, her worn sneakers, or the simplicity of her hairstyle that hid the unruly strands of hair she'd tiredly worn. However, no one noticed that, seated at one of the farthest tables, a man with an attentive gaze silently observed the scene. The contrast was stark. His dark-tailored suit, his gleaming watch, and his calm demeanor completely clashed with the fast food setting. He didn't seem like just any ordinary customer. His eyes fixed on the young woman as if searching for more than just an order on the menu, as if there was a story yet to be revealed. While she struggled to balance trays and smiles, unaware of her silent scrutiny, the environment continued its chaotic routine. For everyone else, it was just another night at Burger King. For her, it was another chapter in survival. For him, it was the beginning of something that would completely change the fate of everyone there. From a young age, her life was never easy. She was born in a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Detroit, in a wooden house that barely withstood the biting winter cold. Her father had disappeared before her first birthday, leaving only confused memories of an absent figure and unfulfilled promises. Her overworked mother struggled with 2 jobs, but food still ran out and bills piled up on the old kitchen table. Growing up in this environment made her accustomed to surviving amidst want, but also someone who learned early on to bear the brunt of others' contempt. At school, she was constantly the target of cruel comments because of her simple clothes, often donated by neighbors, and the cheap snacks she carried in a plastic bag. Yet, she held her head high, harboring within herself a quiet strength that no one seemed to notice. Adolescence brought no relief but more wounds. At 15, she lost her mother in a car accident. The news came brutally one cold night when a neighbor knocked on her door, tragedy in her eyes. Suddenly, she found herself alone in the world, without family, without support, dependent on the foster care system that never managed to offer her true affection. She moved through different homes, some better, some worse, but in each, she carried the feeling of being an unwanted burden. She learned to cook, to clean, to care for others, but no one seemed willing to care for her. Birthdays passed in silence, without hugs or gifts, and her childhood dreams slowly faded. Upon reaching adulthood, she was pushed out of the system with nowhere to go. She rented a tiny room in a run-down building, supporting herself with temporary jobs, sometimes cleaning offices, sometimes babysitting neighbors' children. The money was barely enough to eat, but she refused to give up. It was during this period that she landed a job at Burger King. To many, it was a worthless job, but to her, it meant an opportunity to survive with dignity. She used every penny to pay the rent and saved what she could, however little, so that one day she could go back to school. A past marked by abandonment and pain had shaped her in silence. Behind the simple uniform and tired eyes, there was a young woman who carried invisible scars and a resilience forged through suffering. She didn't talk about it to anyone, because she learned that the more she revealed her fragility, the more people used it against her. She kept everything silent, like someone hiding a precious treasure. Little did she know that this same silence would one day be the key to turning her story upside down. It was a Friday night, and Burger King was busier than ever. Lines at the counter, full tables, and impatient customers. The place buzzed with voices, orders being called, fryers popping, and the heavy smell of fries hung in the air. Among the employees, fatigue mixed with irritation, and any slip-up became fodder for cruel jokes. It was in this atmosphere that the teasing began. One of the more arrogant colleagues, a young man with a shrill laugh, decided to turn the protagonist's fatigue into a source of amusement. "I bet she can't even hold a full tray without dropping half of it on the floor," he said loudly, drawing laughter from the group gathered near the counter. Some customers turned, intrigued by his mocking tone. The manager, instead of cutting the scene, encouraged the mood, crossing his arms and commenting, "Good idea. Let's see if she's any good today besides delaying orders." The young woman froze, feeling their gazes pierce her like blades. Her heart raced, her hands trembled, but she knew she couldn't refuse. If she took a step back, she'd be humiliated even further. They placed a heavy tray before her, piled high with cups of soda and snacks, more than any server would normally carry at once. It was a cruel test, but disguised as a joke. Her colleagues laughed, betting quietly among themselves whether she would trip before reaching the first table. Some even pulled out their phones, ready to record her fall, to turn her embarrassment into cheap entertainment on social media. The walk to the table felt like an endless corridor. Each step was accompanied by whispers and stifled laughter. She breathed deeply, trying to control the trembling in her hands, but the pressure was unbearable. As she passed the group of young customers, one of them discreetly stuck out his foot, and the tray nearly tipped over. Her heart raced. There was a muffled scream, a loud laugh, and the soda wobbled dangerously in its glass. She managed to regain her balance, but the humiliation was already etched in everyone's eyes. Upon reaching the table, she delicately placed her orders, trying to ignore the audience anxiously awaiting a mistake. But as she turned to return to the counter, fate seemed to conspire. One of her colleagues pretended to bump into her shoulder, and the empty tray slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a crash. Glasses rolled, ketchup splattered on her uniform, and general laughter echoed through the room. The manager, with a cold smile, delivered the sentence, "You don't even serve for free. Imagine being paid for that." The humiliation was complete. Cell phone cameras captured the exact moment she, motionless, with teary eyes, seemed to be falling apart in front of everyone. The room was still filled with the echo of laughter when the silence of a firm voice cut through the air like a blade. The man in the dark suit slowly stood up, his every movement drawing everyone's attention. He walked toward the girl, his eyes fixed on her as if he could see far beyond the embarrassment that suffocated her. The young woman, cowering in the midst of the chaos, looked up for a moment, surprised by his presence. It wasn't common for someone to interfere. Normally everyone just watched, but there was something different about this stranger. His posture was calm yet imposing, as if he carried within him an authority that needed no announcement. He slowly bent down to pick up the fallen tray, an unexpected gesture that silenced the last of the laughter. The manager, annoyed, tried to intervene. "Sir, you don't need to get involved. This employee is always causing problems." But before he could continue, the man raised his hand, requesting silence without needing words. He handed the tray back to the young woman, his eyes locked with hers, and said quietly but firmly, "You didn't make a mistake. They made a mistake in thinking this was a laughing matter." It was the first time anyone had defended her like that. Her heart raced, not from the praise, but from the feeling that, for the first time in a long time, someone was seeing her humanity. Her colleagues looked at each other in confusion, while the cell phones that had previously been recording with the intention of exposing her now continued filming out of pure curiosity. She didn't know who that man was, but she felt that this moment would change everything. The manager, his face hardened with anger at being interrupted in front of everyone, took 2 steps forward and raised his voice to regain his authority. "I'm in charge here. This girl is dead weight, and a heroic client isn't going to change that." The words echoed through the room like hammer blows. His colleagues, still stifling nervous giggles, began to smile mischievously again, supporting their boss's harsh tone. The crowd at the tables began to whisper, some laughing at the situation, others simply watching as if witnessing a cruel spectacle. The young woman, tray still in hand, felt her face burn, her eyes sting. But she didn't shed tears. Her silence only seemed to provoke more contempt. One of the employees, encouraged by the manager's glare, decided to push the humiliation even further. "Want to bet she can't hold down a job anywhere? She's probably just here because no one else wanted to hire her." Laughter broke out, this time accompanied by ironic applause from some young customers who were filming the whole thing for later posting. "Look, Burger King comedy show version," one of them shouted. The entire restaurant seemed to feed off her embarrassment, turning it into cheap entertainment. The man in the suit remained silent, watching as the protagonist pressed her fingers against the tray as if it were her last remaining shield. The manager, feeling strengthened by the collective support, delivered the final blow. He approached her, and with a smile full of contempt, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You'll never get beyond this. You'll always be the girl who clears tables and drops trays. That's your place. Get used to it." These words fell like stones on her chest, echoing in every corner of her memory where the scars of abandonment still burned. The laughter, the raised cell phones, the mocking looks, everything around her seemed to crush her. It was at that moment that the young woman, still silent, looked up. She wasn't crying, wasn't begging, just staring at the manager with an unexpected calm, as if she carried within herself a secret no one there could understand. This serenity disconcerted some in the audience, but not enough to silence the mockery. The public humiliation was complete, and the contempt had reached its peak. However, in that restrained silence, there was a silent promise that it wouldn't end there. The hours that followed that night seemed to drag by like an invisible weight. The protagonist continued working in silence, clearing tables, clearing trays, serving customers, as if nothing had happened. But inside her, a calm fire was beginning to burn. What no one knew was that she wasn't as naive as she appeared. From her first day at that Burger King, she had noticed the sidelong Glances, the traps and the gossip. She had learned to listen without reacting, to absorb the venom of others without letting it corrode her essence. She carried a small, worn notebook in her pocket, where she wrote down everything she saw: lateness from colleagues who accused her of laziness, the manager's mistakes that fell upon her, small abuses disguised as jokes, not because she planned immediate revenge, but because she knew that one day these truths would have value. That same night, after collecting the last tray, she approached the manager, still surrounded by colleagues laughing at the scene that had occurred hours earlier. She looked him in the eye and said in a low but firm voice, "It's funny how you think you know everything about me. Did you really think I didn't notice every word, every trap, every cell phone pointed at me? I know everything. I know who's absent and blaming me. I know who takes food without paying. I know every stolen overtime. I even know who you think no one is watching." Silence fell heavily. Her colleagues glanced at each other nervously, as if each had suddenly been unmasked. The manager tried to laugh, but his tone sounded forced. "And what are you going to do with that, girl? Writing it down doesn't give you any power." But inside he felt a chill run down his spine. She didn't need to answer. The simple act of revealing that she knew everything, that she wasn't the naive employee everyone imagined, had already changed the game. At the back of the diner, the man in the suit watched her even more closely. There was something about that calculated calm, that quiet courage, that aroused deep respect in him. She wasn't just a humiliated employee. He was someone who bore the weight of life in silence, but with eyes that saw much more than he let on. For the first time, the audience that used to laugh didn't dare speak. She had planted a seed of discomfort, the certainty that the easy target wasn't so easy after all. The cue. Morning after the humiliating episode, the man in the suit quietly returned to the restaurant. He sat down again at a corner table, ordering only a coffee, but his eyes were fixed on the young woman working silently, as always. He couldn't shake the firmness in her gaze the night before, that air of someone who knew much more than she let on. There was something there that deeply intrigued him. When he finally managed to speak to one of the older employees, a tired man who didn't participate in his colleagues' mockery, he decided to strike up a conversation. "That girl is the one on the night shift. How long has she been working here?" he asked neutrally. The hesitant employee replied, "About 2 years, I think, but her life wasn't easy. They say she lost her mother early and grew up in the system. She never had anyone for her." The millionaire listened silently, but his thoughts went deeper. There was something familiar in that story, a detail that began to stir memories. That night, back at the office, he asked his assistant to discreetly investigate. The next day, an envelope lay on his desk. When he opened it, he found information that astonished him. The young woman was the daughter of a woman he had known in the past, a woman who had worked at his company years ago, someone he deeply respected for her honesty and tireless effort. The file also revealed the tragedy: her mother's death in an accident, her father's disappearance, and her years in foster care. His heart sank. That surname, almost erased from his memory, now loomed like a ghost. He remembered promising that mother that if she ever needed it, he would take care of her daughter. But time, business, and the coldness of life had driven him away from that memory. Now fate brought him face to face with the silent debt he carried. In that moment, he no longer saw just a humiliated employee. He saw a link to his own past, a connection that made it impossible to look away. The secret was right in front of him. The girl everyone ridiculed was the same one he'd sworn years ago never to abandon, even without her knowing it. The next morning, when the millionaire returned to Burger King, the scene was different. The fryers hissed, customers came and went as usual, but she wasn't there. The counter seemed empty without the silent presence of that young woman who, despite carrying a world of pain in her shoulders, moved with the discipline of someone who knew every gesture was vital. He waited, disguising his anxiety with a coffee slowly cooling on the table, but the shift ended and she never appeared. He discreetly asked an employee, who replied indifferently, "She quit, said she wasn't coming back, she disappeared." No more details, as if she were just another disposable cog in that machine of red uniforms and oil-stained caps. In the days that followed, The millionaire found himself restless, returning each night, even knowing he might not find her. The restaurant, once just another of his franchises, now seemed heavy with silence. He noticed the fake laughter of the employees, the arrogance of the manager, but what weighed most heavily was her absence. It was as if the injustice had left a void. Without realizing it, he began to remember her mother, the firm gaze and tireless dedication that had marked his early years at the company. He remembered the simple conversations, the trust he felt in an employee who never asked for anything, but who carried a rare dignity. Now he understood. That same flame was in his daughter, even stifled by grief. The millionaire began searching for clues. He asked his driver to check the surrounding area and discreetly chatted with acquaintances, but always received vague answers. "I think she lived in a cheap little room. Maybe she moved to another neighborhood. Nobody really knows." It was as if she had vanished from the map, like dust blown away by the wind. Her absence, however, haunted him. For the first time in a long time, a real emptiness grew within him. It wasn't just the discomfort of failing to fulfill an old promise, but the feeling that he had lost something greater, something that couldn't be bought with millions, nor resolved with a contract. On long nights alone in his glass-enclosed penthouse, surrounded by luxury and silence, he found himself recalling the scene of the falling tray, the echoing laughter, and her steady gaze amidst her humiliation. It returned like a spectre, reminding him that, despite all his money and power, he had failed. And for the first time he missed not someone who could serve him, but someone who, with her quiet strength, reminded him of who he had once been before he lost himself in the glow of success. Local newspapers soon caught on. A customer who had filmed the entire scene at Burger King posted it on social media, and within hours the video went viral. It wasn't just the girl's humiliation that drew attention, but also the moment the millionaire had stood up to defend her. People began discussing in the comments, who was that well-dressed man? What was he doing in a suburban diner? And most importantly, why was that manager speaking so arrogantly on camera? The repercussion grew, and journalists soon investigated. They discovered that the man wasn't just any customer, but the owner of the entire franchise. The emerging narrative wasn't favorable to him. Millionaire shows up at restaurant and exposes humiliation against poor employee. Many saw him as a belated vigilante, someone who had watched the scene unfold before acting. Others accused him of complicity. If he's the owner, why did he let things get to this point? The pressure mounted, and the impeccable image he had cultivated in the business world began to crack. Meanwhile, the girl remained missing. Her absence fueled the press's curiosity even more. Who is the mysterious employee? Headlines blared. Social media demanded answers, and every detail of his past was dissected on forums and TV shows. Former employees emerged for interviews, some praising him, others denouncing the coldness of their boss, who rarely cared about the human side of the story. At that point, the millionaire realized he no longer controlled the narrative. His public downfall came not from the loss of money, but from the social judgment that placed him before an uncomfortable mirror. The public wanted to see how far he would bear the weight of his own omission. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling numbers, companies, and people with the coldness of contracts, began to realize that his entire life had been built on glass walls. The public criticism, the comments on social media, the journalists knocking on the door of his reputation, all of this was like an earthquake that shattered the artificial security he'd been carrying. For the first time in years, he found himself alone in his penthouse, surrounded by luxury, but without a single trusted person by his side. The silence weighed on him more than any headline. In the following days, instead of fleeing the storm, he began to reflect. He walked through the city without security, disguised, and observed ordinary workers, mothers carrying 2 heavy bags and still smiling at their children, young people balancing 2 jobs, elderly people selling small goods on the street. It was as if he suddenly saw the world he had always ignored. The girl's face wouldn't leave his mind, not the humiliated face, but the firm gaze she held amidst the collective contempt. It haunted him like a truth that could no longer be silenced. He began to reconsider past decisions. He visited former franchise units and interviewed employees for the first time without announcing his identity. He heard stories of neglect but also of resilience. He discovered that true value lay not in weekly profits, but in the dignity of those who kept the wheels turning with their sweat. Little by little, the pride that had kept him distant gave way to a humility he barely knew how to cultivate. At night, alone, he would search through old photos until he found one stored in forgotten boxes. The young woman's mother, smiling at a simple company party, holding an improvised cake. He remembered how she radiated strength even in the face of hardship, and how she had promised to care for her daughter if ever needed. Now he understood that life had given him the chance to fulfill that promise, but not with money, contracts, or positions. The transformation that needed to begin wasn't external, it was within him. And so between the weight of shame and the search for redemption, a silent decision was born within him. It wasn't enough to just find the girl again. He needed to be different when that happened. Their reunion didn't happen in a grandiose fashion, but rather in the simplicity of a rainy afternoon. The millionaire, already transformed by the weight of his own conscience, had decided to truly search for her, not with his assistance, but with his own steps. He walked the narrow streets of the neighborhood where he had discovered her living, knocking on doors, asking in markets and bakeries, until he finally spotted her. The young woman was crossing the street with a shopping bag in her hand, her old umbrella struggling against the wind. He stopped, not daring to call out immediately, simply observing the contrast. That same silent firmness in her gaze, the same erect posture of someone who has learned to survive amid contempt. When he finally approached her, she turned, surprised but not frightened. There was no anger in her gaze, but no tenderness either. It was a calculated calm, as if she had been waiting for this moment. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. The words that had once flowed easily in business meetings now weighed like stones. He said only, "I failed you. I failed your mother. And I failed myself." The bag she was holding shook slightly, but her face remained impassive. They walked together to a small corner cafe where they sat across from each other. The tension was almost palpable, but different from that night at Burger King. Now there was no audience, no cell phones, no laughter. Just two people connected by a past that time had tried to bury. He told her what he had discovered, showed her the old photo of her mother he had kept, talked about the forgotten promise and how life was exacting its toll. She listened in silence, her eyes welling up, but without letting the tears fall. With each word his heart shattered and rebuilt itself simultaneously. When she finished, the silence hung heavy. She took a deep breath and simply said, "I've always known life has a strange way of putting people in the right place at the right time, but that doesn't mean I have to go back to where they hurt me." He lowered his eyes, understanding that forgiveness wasn't automatic, that there were scars that no amount of money could erase. Still, in that reunion, there was a seed of something new, a space where pain and hope intertwined. She stared at him for long seconds, as if weighing not only the words, but the years of pain, silence, and dignity she had borne alone. The millionaire before her was no longer the imposing figure in the impeccable suit. He was just a man, vulnerable, asking for something money could never buy, the chance to be forgiven. She took a deep breath, letting the silence fill every space between them, before finally speaking. "You talk about failing me and my mother, but what happened isn't just a forgotten promise. I grew up alone, heard laughter that hurt more than any slap, swallowed tears because there was no one to comfort me. And now you appear, bringing back memories I fought to bury, waiting for me to simply say it's okay." The words came out firmly, not as an attack, but as the confession of someone no longer afraid to expose their scars. He lowered his head, unable to bear the weight of those truths. And it was in that instant that she realized something. The transformation in him wasn't an act. There was sincerity in his weary gaze, in the trembling of his hands, in the silence that made no attempt to defend itself. She could choose to hurt him back, turn her back and disappear again, leaving him forever with the pain of guilt. But she could also choose to break the cycle her entire life had tried to impose on her, carrying grudges that corroded her insides. "I won't forget," he said, his voice breaking. "What happened is part of who I am, but I don't want to live trapped in hate, not for you but for myself. I forgive you, but that doesn't mean I'll return to your world. My path is different, and I need to follow it without being anyone's shadow." Tears finally escaped her eyes, not from weakness but from liberation. The millionaire looked up, shocked by the enormity of that decision. He didn't gain her company, but he received something even more precious: the chance to start over, knowing that forgiveness doesn't erase but transforms. And in that moment the silence between them was more eloquent than any speech. The light rain continued to fall over the city when she got up from the table in the small cafe. The millionaire watched her silently, powerless to stop her, understanding that the decision was no longer his. She stepped out into the street, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. The old umbrella opened again against the wind, and her figure receded between cars and the reflections of lights in the puddle. He remained seated, the photo of her mother still on the table, damp from the drops that had run from his trembling hands. Hours later, alone in his penthouse, he approached the enormous glass window that overlooked the city skyline. The reflection in the glass was no longer that of the powerful man, but of someone stripped of their masks. On the table behind him rested the same photo of his mother, now in a simple frame. He looked at the city, then at the portrait, and finally closed his eyes. Outside, a distant siren cut through the night, mingled with the sound of rain. The invisible camera of this fate showed them in two different worlds, she walking along the wet sidewalk, her firm steps no longer bearing the weight of humiliation, and he standing before the silence of his empire, holding a portrait that represented the broken bond and, at the same time, the possible redemption. No final words were necessary. Only the contrast, a young woman disappearing into the flow of life, and a man alone silently learning that some losses are, in fact, the only way to transform. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below, I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.